Hey everyone, and welcome to the second video in my LPL Worlds Reflection series. If you haven't seen my first video yet, please check that out. I'll be linking it above. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about IG. As I promised in my previous video, I'm going to do one video where I do a deeper dive into each of the 4 LPL Worlds representatives. And this video is going to be a little bit different because IG, not only do they only play 4 games, but all those games came from one best of 5 series. And so with the other teams, I can't really look at how they played against one individual opponent, but here I'm going to be looking all at IG versus T1. I'm going to start off talking about my perception of their team identity going into Worlds and what I thought maybe their game plan should be. And then I'm going to look at their drafts throughout the series as well as some of the most important parts of their gameplay that I think really summarize what happened and what went wrong for them. Hopefully you guys enjoy. IG as a team were really kind of all over the place throughout all of 2025, but I think in the summer split, they really started to get a clear identity for themselves as the premier late game team of the LPL. Funny enough, if they somehow managed to find themselves with a gold lead at 15 minutes, they won 85% of the time compared to their 59% win rate throughout all of summer into Worlds. I think also as well, they averaged roughly negative 500 gold at 15 minutes, which is pretty crazy if you think about it because Group Ascend in the LPL had a few big bottom feeder teams that all the top teams should be farming massive gold leads off of before 15 minutes to skew their averages. I don't think that the early games were bad because they were bad laners. I think Rookie was a pretty solid laner for most of this year. The Shy generally was doing okay in lane, and I think the bot lane, Gala Mako, were easily one of the best duo lanes in the LPL. From an individual standpoint, I really do think that Gala and Mako were the best players on IG in summer. While both of them really struggled at earlier parts of the year, I think in summer they really turned it up a notch and were very deserving of the second team All-Pros that both of them won. I think if it weren't for the amazing summer split that Jackie Love and Hong had, where I think those two players probably were my top 2 picks for MVP, then Gala and Mako would have had a very good shot at being first team All-Pro. As for the Shy, he sort of found a bit of an interesting identity as a psychotic weak side top laner, sort of akin to the role that Bwipo can sometimes play when you put him on tanks. I think the Shy has very strong laning fundamentals, and so even when the enemy team was throwing a lot of stuff at him and his team weren't really giving him a lot of resources, he was still able to not fall behind too far while creating a lot of space in team fights for his carries. Obviously, he does run it the heck down sometimes, and that's unfortunate, but overall, I do think he was very beneficial in this role for his team. As for Rookie really started off the summer split in a dominating fashion, and I think people were rightfully saying that, hey, maybe he'll be an MVP this split, but very quickly that started to drop off and even started to dip lower in playoffs where it looked like Rookie would somehow manage to find a way to not return to Worlds once again, but thankfully his team turned it around, and I think at the very end in the regional finals he did start to play a little bit better, and they managed to scrape it to Worlds as the 4th seed. Finally, Wei, I think he's such a hard player to get a read on. I'm a little partial to him because I think that his accomplishments on 2021 and 2022 RNG are kind of understated, partly because of the fact that the team flopped at Worlds, but as I mentioned in my previous video, I do think 2021 RNG were a really, really strong team at Worlds, and Wei was a big part of that. As for 2022, we know that the team got really badly sick, and they played what was probably one of the closest 3-0s I've ever seen against T1 in the 2022 quarterfinals. So yeah, I do think that damages his legacy a lot. Obviously, since then, he's been a very weird player. In 2024, he had a super dominant summer with BLG. And then in Worlds, he completely flopped and got subbed out for Shun. And then this year, once again, he looked like he really just was not meshing well with BLG. And finally, in his time on IG replacing Jie, I think he had his moments, but overall, he was not the strongest player. I think his most picked champion throughout the summer split was Vi, and I don't think he looked particularly great on it. But he wasn't the kind of player that sort of didn't belong on a top team the way Wayward has in the past, or Hope or Beishuan did this year. They did kind of have a disappointing end to the playoffs by losing to AL. I think generally throughout the summer split, they looked much better than AL, and yeah, the fact that they lost to AL in the lower bracket of the playoffs meant that AL ended up going as the LPL's 2nd seed, when I think if you look at their performance throughout summer, they were the 4th best team in the LPL and not the 2nd best team. I do think IG kind of shot themselves in the foot by losing this series, and because of that, they had to play in the play-ins for Worlds, which was kind of sad for IG fans. Going into the series, I think the expectations for me and just about everyone were that T1 would walk away as the winners. I think the biggest issue, if you look at how these teams would match up, is the jungle. While Wei wasn't some completely awful player in the LPL, I think that it's pretty clear that Owner was just a far better player. I had him as a top 3 player going into Worlds, and by the end of the tournament, I think he probably had a top 2 performance right after BDD. Maybe you could put him above BDD even, but I wouldn't. And as for the other big threats on T1, Keria, when you give him his champs and he's able to get a good support counter pick into your comp, the game just is going to become completely unplayable. I think a similar thing could be said for Guma, less maybe about the counter picks, but more so at least the perception of Guma coming into the series was, and coming into Worlds in general, was all about his picks. Maybe he seemed like a player that people worried would struggle in Fearless, and keep him off of his Ashe, keep him off of his Varus, and you'll have a much better time, although he did a good job of rewriting the script on that for this Worlds tournament, pulling off good performances on things like the Kaisa, which I think maybe people didn't expect out of him. I think the weak links for T1, I mean, it feels bad to say it, but really, domestically, Faker pretty much always looks like the weak link for the team. His laning in particular, I think he's pretty reliant on Keria and sometimes Owner as well to come mid and alleviate pressure and kind of bail him out to make sure that he's not falling too far behind in lane. Doran as well, I do think this is definitely one of the better years in his career, but he wasn't a strong point of the team by any means, and I think looking at the matchup with IG, it would be fair to consider the Shy as the better player coming into the series. I think what IG would need to do coming into this series is really prioritize a pushing bot lane, and that's for a few reasons. One, I think that Gala was definitely a better player in the summer split than Gumayushi was, and so you're playing around your strongest player, playing with to give him prio. But at the same time, I think it's really important to have a pushing bottom lane versus T1 for a few different reasons. One of them is that it prevents Keria from being able to have free reign over the map and come and roam mid and help Faker out. But also, when I say pushing lane, I'm kind of implying a counter pick in the lane. I do think getting yourself a strong support matchup against T1 is really, really important. And then also, I think another thing that should be prioritized is good, strong picks for Rookie in the laning phase. And while what we had last seen from Rookie before this World Series was his kind of spiral into pretty poor play in playoffs and then in the gauntlet, I do think that a big play for IG would be to give Rookie these comfortable matchups like they did in some cases in the series to allow him to punish Faker in lane and get some really strong leads. Looking at the Game 1 draft, I think the bans from both teams were very standard, especially the opening 3. IG banned away 3 picks that you just want to take away from T1, and T1 banned the Yunara, which is a standard ban against the blue side, and taking away 2 picks that the enemy carries are especially noted for, so that makes sense. The opening Ryze pick for Rookie, I don't think you're particularly scared of the Ryze counter picks on the side of T1. I don't think Eastern teams were aware of Anivia as a Ryze counter pick yet, and Faker's Cassio is not something you're really scared of in 2025. He did play it once against CFO, and I don't think it was a particularly great look. I guess Syndra is a good Ryze counter pick as well, but that wasn't really something that popped up too much in the World's meta. Shanks had 1 game on it, and he looked okay in that game 5, but yeah, I don't know, it's just not amazing. The response from T1 here also makes a lot of sense. Talia is a pretty good answer into the Ryze. Nothing crazy, but it's less side lane focused, but maybe a little easier to make plays on early. The Trundle for Owner makes a lot of sense. Give Owner something that's going to have a lot of tempo in the game. And then I think the response from IG also makes a lot of sense. You have the Corki that is going to be a strong early game pushing champ, really good in the skirmishes, and the Nico, which most of the time should get you the pushing lane and is a really strong and powerful team fighting tool. And then from here, the follow-up bans, I don't think there's too much to explain there. I do think maybe the Vi ban is a little bit strange from T1, but it was Wei's most played champ going into this series, but I don't think he was particularly amazing at it. The Sivir pick actually is pretty smart. I think that based on all the champs that have showed so far, it doesn't have too hard of a time playing the game. I think against the Nico, you can spell shield her ult. And actually, Sivir is going to be able to get you some early prio against this double ranged lane. I guess I skipped over the Mbessa from Doran. I don't think there's really anything crazy to say there. And then the response from IG here on the B4, B5, the Kiana, I do think this is a decent Kiana game. It's nothing crazy. This was Wei's first Kiana of the year and his third Kiana game ever. So it's not something he's played a ton of, although maybe he was practicing it a bunch. I'm not sure. And I think the casters were right to call out the fact that it would pair pretty well with the Nico here, giving it something to set up. I mean, Kiana is pretty setup dependent in pro play. She's very slippery, but ultimately you're going to want someone to be able to create space for her to come in and combo the enemy team. I think something we saw pop up a bunch throughout Worlds was Alistar being paired with the Kiana. The Alistar could just jump in, CC a target, and Kiana can blow them up. We saw the Alistar being used to dive side lanes with the Kiana. So here, obviously, there's no Alistar for the Kiana, but Nico, as we know from her cannon minion transformation, can be used as a tool for diving side lanes. And it does provide really good teamfight setup. And then the Rek'Sai, I think I had some highlights playing of that game earlier in this video from, I think it was the regional finals where the Shy was playing his Rek'Sai. He was, I believe, the only top laner at Worlds that played the Rek'Sai in Summer Split. And he looks really good at it, just constantly harassing Jackie Love. There's no other word for it. It's just complete harassment, jumping on him, flashing on him, and making it really hard for him to play the game when that happens. So I think he was relatively comfortable on it. And as opposed to how it fits into the enemy team, I think it's something that can take heavy trades against the Mbessa, which won't be super favorable necessarily, and then heal himself back up and be able to continue to play out that laning phase. I do think that it will also really help the Kiana to try and create a lot of chaos in the team fights and buy a lot of space for her to be able to pull off some sort of combo play. So I do like that. And then finally, the R5 Alistar. And I do think that Alistar pairs really nicely with Sivir. Something that Alistar struggles with a lot is that his level 1 sucks. But with Sivir, you can kind of just take W on the Sivir and still manage to get push. And then that kind of nullifies the level 1 weakness of Alistar a little bit. Unless you're playing against a ridiculously oppressive 2v2 lane. And the Sivir as well, I think something people always talk about, and rightfully so, is that Sivir is only a champ that works if she can really easily hit the champs in front of her. And yeah, you could say that about every ADC champ, but I do think that's a consideration, particularly for the Sivir. And Alistar really helps with that with his peel. He makes it really easy for Sivir to just hit the champs in front of her and makes her team fighting job much easier. So overall, I don't think anyone came away from this Game 1 draft particularly favored, and I do like some of the angles that IG took here. Looking at the Game 2 draft, I do think that, once again, IG ticked a lot of the checkboxes on what they want. I think, obviously, in the Game 1, they were in a super favorable position, and then they just completely tossed it away and lost despite having the Infernal Soul. Here, once again, they get a pretty good champ for Rookie. Really, his best champ. I think, he's easily a top 3 Orianna of all time. And looking at the bottom lane, they definitely tick the box of a pushing lane, while MF is a decent answer to the Caitlyn. There's no way they're going to get Prio with the Rakan against the Caitlyn and Karma. So I love that there from them. The Shy is on one of his 3 picks that I kind of identified earlier in the video. The Rumble, the Scion, and the Ornn were 3 champs that he really started to find a strong identity with this year, especially in the summer split. So I think that's great there. And then looking at the enemy team, I think the Wukong can both be used to disrupt something like the MF ult, but also functions really well as peel and counter engage against things like the J4, or even the Akali or the Rakan. So yeah, I like really a lot of what IG were able to get in this draft. I think their bans once again made a lot of sense, and I do think that T1 made a huge mistake leaving open the Orianna for Rookie, who just completely dominated T1 this game. Here in the Game 3 draft, I think this is really the story of the Yunara, the Xin Zhao, the Hui, and the Smolder. I think that Yunara is a huge power pick that typically you really want to ban when you're on the red side, so leaving that open was a bit of an interesting decision from IG. I don't know if they thought Guma wouldn't be able to play it well. I think that doesn't really make all that much sense. And then, of course, Owner's Xin Zhao is really scary. In general, I think players who are really good at that champ just can completely swing the way a game feels. And while I do think that Xin Zhao is much stronger when he has some sort of enchanter on his team, as well as champs that are able to allow him to create more space, he also kind of got that this game. I do think that the Renata is going to be able to put a lot of juice on the Xin Zhao, and Galio as well is going to be huge for setting up the fights, and even the Annie. Annie flash Tibbers and then following that up with the Xin Zhao is huge. So I think T1 has a lot of threats, especially in terms of how they can set up Owner to be monstrous this game. And really, what you would look for from IG here, I do think that the Smolder pick here does make a good amount of sense. You've seen that they've picked the Galio, and you can be pretty sure that's going to go top. And yes, they got the counter pick on your Rumble, but now you can send the Smolder top to just farm stacks off of the Galio, and the Galio has absolutely no threat in the early game into the Smolder, so you can avoid that laning phase. So I thought that was, at least I'm hoping that's what they had in mind when they saw that. And I do think that the Hui pick, the R5 Hui from IG, was an incredible choice. I think that artillery mages are heavily underutilized into Annie. The last time I think I really saw someone punishing an Annie pick with an artillery mage that really stood out to me was in the LCS. Balulu pulled out a Vel'Koz against Annie, and as a Vel'Koz man, that made me really happy to see, but I think that Hui can fill that spot very easily, and that played out exactly the way you'd think. He just dominated Faker in lane and created a massive lead for himself. I think from a draft perspective, IG's comp isn't the most cohesive, although I do think the benefits that the Smolder and the Hui provide in this draft should just be enough to win you the game, regardless of the fact that T1 does have some really strong things going for them. For this final draft of the series, I think that this is really where things started to massively unravel for IG. I don't mind the Game 4 Pantheon B1 pick. I do think that T1 were able to find a lot of champs that don't particularly mind playing against the Pantheon, but Pantheon does immediately open you up with a composition that gives you a number of clear ways that you can move into. You can move into champs that are going to play off of his stun. You can move into champs that are going to similarly want to skirmish along with the Pantheon. There's a number of things you can do there. I think that the Nocturne answer from T1, maybe there's something I'm missing here, but I don't know. It doesn't particularly stand out to me as an amazing answer. The Ashe pick, I think that's a really strong champ for Gumayushi. I think probably would be a lot better to ban the Ashe instead of an early ban, like an early Braum ban. It's just a really strange thing to do. It tells the enemy team a lot about what you want to do when you ban Braum. You're basically showing them your cards before you pull them out. And I don't think that T1 necessarily knew that this is what IG wanted to do in a Game 4. So I just don't understand. And then the response with the Ziggs and Nautilus, I don't love this. Partly because I think that you have to be really selective with where you're going to pick melee supports against T1. I think sometimes T1 will pick their champs in a way that gives you a free melee support spot, but that was not really the case here. I think we know that Keria has a number of different pairings that he can pull out with an Ashe to create an absolutely oppressive 2v2 lane, and it's not like you're going to want to swap the Ziggs top or something to give him gold in the early levels. So yeah, I don't particularly love the Nautilus. I think maybe they think it makes sense with the Pantheon. I don't love it. And then I think really what they should have done is picked Ornn on the B3 pick, because Ornn is a champ that you really want the Shy to be on. And yes, it does mean that you're going to have some magic damage there with the Ziggs, and then you're going to either really want an AD mid laner, or what I think should have happened is just pivot the Ziggs mid lane. But I don't know that Rookie plays it. Knight had some amazing Ziggs mid games in the LPL, especially against Azir. Yeah, I do think this kind of put them in a bit of a twist. They were smart to ban the Seraphine away from Keria, but I think Keria got an incredible amount of value on the Lulu. And then looking at the mid matchup, Sylas is... I know in the past, LeBlanc one tricks like Bobchin were somewhat frustrated by playing against Sylas because they felt that Sylas could just tank all of the damage they put onto it in the laning phase and just heal it back up. But I do think that in a pro setting that LeBlanc is a pretty strong champ to play into the Sylas. And then, of course, T1's going to have the bottom lane prio, so Keria is going to be able to move mid, and anytime a Lulu is around in the mid lane against a Sylas, there's just no way you're going to play the game. You're going to be slowed. It's going to be impossible for you to walk up and last hit. And if you try to dive in to kill them, you're just going to get polymorphed and you are completely unable to play the game. So I think that the Sylas pick here was just a massive blunder on their part. And then there's the funny blue 5 pivot with the Varus top, which I think is not as bad as people thought it was. I don't love it here, but it is going to provide you with a strong lane against the Ornn, and we saw that the Shy absolutely demolished Dorn in lane, which you kind of expect and you really need for this pick to become viable. I think a lot of the criticism for this pick is that later on in the game, it's going to provide like no team fighting value and it's going to be an easy target to pick off. But I think something that people really don't think about with Varus is that you have unbelievable flexibility when it comes to the items that you can build on this champion. I think that his build that game actually was incredibly smart. The pivot into the Zhonya's was just really good against what the enemy team had. And I do think that if IG didn't toss away the game in the earlier stages and Rookie wasn't getting just completely demolished in the mid lane, that they would have been fine. Like, I don't think that the Varus was something that cost them the game compared to a lot of the other stuff that they had, which was just, I think, a really poor composition when you look at what T1 has. I mean, the Lulu is going to be really good at stopping their engage, really good against these melee champions. The LeBlanc, I don't think, feels a huge amount of threat from them. They do have some point-and-click CC, but the Ashe also, I don't think, is under a crazy amount of threat. The Ornn is going to be really strong into IG's comp. I think they really set them up at a huge draft loss in this game, and I'm really not surprised as to how it turned out. From a gameplay standpoint, Game 3 is actually the only game that I'm going to go into in depth. I think there's a pretty good reason why when you look at the other games. Game 1 is really IG played a really good mid-game around the spike on their Corki, with some really good team fighting around the Otacon that netted them a really good gold lane, and that combined with the fact that they had the dragon stacking, they had an Infernal Soul, that was their game to win, and they completely tossed it off of the Shy inting, and then the rest of their team just kind of running it down and getting caught in succession by T1. I don't think it's really all that interesting to look at that game unless we want to look at some good team fighting around that Otacon fight. Game 2, I think, was kind of just a steamroll by IG. It was a super convincing win, and you know, Rookie's Orianna was incredible. I thought that Wei played a really good game that game as well, and as I was watching this series, coming out of that game 2, it felt great. It was like, heck, game 1 was completely in IG's hands, and then game 2 was a complete stomp. You know, this is looking really good. And it also had me feeling good for the rest of the tournament because T1, you know, they were playing against IG, and IG is not noted as being a strong early game team. And IG coming off of a really good mid game against T1 in the first game, and then just a really strong game overall in the second game. I thought, you know, T1 might be cooked when they come to play against the better early game teams in the world, but obviously we know how that panned out. And game 3 really just kind of, emotionally at least, this felt like it was the climax of the series, the most heart-wrenching game where it just went back and forth, and it highlighted the fundamental misunderstandings that a lot of the players on IG had about how to play their champions in the game and how to interact with the other champions, really when they were strong, when they should be fighting. And I'm going to look at a few different really important moments from this game that I think defined why IG lost this game. Because from here, game 4, as I mentioned, was like a really weird draft situation, and I'm not surprised that things didn't turn out so well there. So yeah, let's dive right into this game. I want to start my Game 3 gameplay discussion with this first Dragon contest by IG that I think highlights some of how their decision making and thought processes were going throughout this game. I think there were definitely some good things involved with this decision. Like, for example, obviously when you have a Smolder on your team, you're probably going to be sacking objectives, but because they have the Smolder top, their thought process was, hey, we have this Rumble here, we actually have a level 6 spike on the Rumble, Gumayushi's only level 5, we can probably fight this. The Rumble also has the Sork boots, the enemy team is going to have no MR on any of the players that are here. They think maybe they can win this fight, but I think that the really big thing that they're not accounting for is the fact that Rookie is their clear strong point, and a lot of teams are very unpracticed when it comes to playing with artillery mages. Even though Rookie is fed, you can already look by this setup that it's not going to be a fight where he's going to be very successful. First of all, his ult is down, but even if that weren't the case, I still don't think this is a good setup. Artillery mages are not the kind of champion that want to walk into a space and reclaim a territory, even if they have a particularly large gold lead. Like, yes, Mako is somewhat in his vicinity, so he can help him enter into the river here, but he's clearly sectioned off, and it's not going to be able to allow him to use his spells effectively to deal damage, because he might even be using them to create space for himself to then move in, instead of using them directly on enemy champions that his team wants to be killing. And you can see that this fight kind of plays out about as you would expect. And just for some icing on the cake, the Shy had an absolutely terrible Rumble ult here, so yeah. So they were able to trade one here, but it's just completely not worthwhile. The Renata revive as well, like, it's clear that their decision in the moment was just go all in on one person to kill them, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense when the enemy team has a Renata that can just revive the champion, and yeah, there was no way for Wei to get out once he ulted in, so I think it was just a really terrible contest from them, and it turned what could have easily just been deciding to not fight this first Drake into a gold injection for T1 on top of the Dragon. So, like I mentioned, this Otacon contest is really where I just absolutely lost my mind when I was watching this game. And I think the main reason for this is just a complete misunderstanding of the champions that they drafted. I think maybe this is a little counterintuitive, but one of the weakest points in the entire game for Smolder is actually when he's right about to hit his 225 stack point. I think if you were to graph what Smolder's power curve looks like relative to the champions in the game, this is like a weird kind of dipping point right before he's about to reach this spike where he becomes a much more effective champion in the fights. And so right here, when Smolder is maybe at his weakest point relative to the enemy team, they're trying to contest this. And just the positioning that Gala has, right here, he's basically using himself as a poke threat. He thinks he has to posture aggressively here to min-max the damage that he's dishing. But really, he should be taking his time, waiting for this next wave to approach, and trying to get 225. This positioning here from him makes absolutely no sense. I just didn't understand it in the slightest. It's really cocky, and it's not doing anything. He doesn't do anything by standing in front here. And yes, he hit 225 right as they went in, but it doesn't matter. I think this play, especially after what happened with the last Drake, like, the game should be over. Like, this should be T1 win. The game is over. But somehow T1 managed to find a way to hand the game back to IG. So what we're going to be looking at next is how IG managed to take the freest game state ever and throw it back into the hands of T1. I just want to show how IG was able to relatively stabilize the game state here. The last thing we saw was that T1 just took the third Dragon, the on-soul point. They just took the Otacon. But now through a chaotic series of events where IG did make some really silly decisions, they still managed to completely stabilize things. It's not like T1 are playing really well here. IG now has 2 Dragons for themselves. Smolder has 374 stacks. In a second, he's about to complete his Bloodthirsters. He's only less than 500 gold behind Gumayushi, and Rookie is massively ahead of the Annie. I think that in any fight where IG are able to approach and have any kind of setup, I don't really see how T1's going to win. barring some crazy miracle where someone oversteps and they just blow them up and steamroll the rest of the fight. So this is why it frustrates me so much here that when all these things are going well for IG, that Wei, not only is his tempo desynced on the reset, he's now going to opt to queue over the wall and clear this control ward, which just made absolutely no sense to me. Like, it's not as if they're even worried that T1 are on the Baron. They have 3 blue trinkets, and they could easily position 1 blue trinket out of the range of that control ward if they wanted to see them. So, yeah, I mean, Owner just completely tossed the game here. Him dying. After this, T1 got the Baron, and then they managed to snowball the gold once again so that when it did come time for that next dragon fight, it was done. It was over, and IG couldn't find any way back in the game. So I think this game really just does highlight why this series was so frustrating for me and many other LPL fans, because IG, in game 1, managed to create a really strong lead that they threw away. In game 2, they absolutely dominated T1. And now in game 3, T1 was nice enough to hand them repeatedly game states where they could win the game despite their mistakes, and they just refused to capitalize on it in any meaningful way. It's just a brutal series for any LPL fans, and just the start of a tough Worlds. After roasting IG for the last 30 minutes, which I can't lie, felt a little good after the emotional turmoil they put us all through, I do want to talk about what my hopes were for IG after this happened. I think my immediate thoughts obviously were frustration at how they drafted in game 4 and how they chose to play things out in game 3. But I really thought that in the coming days, when I was reflecting on this roster, that actually I kind of liked this roster. I think that once they replaced Jieje with Wei, they did start to look a lot stronger. I think the Shy was on his way into transitioning into an identity for himself that I really liked for him. I think he displayed in this series that he's still a massive inter a lot of the time, and he wasn't quite there yet. But I thought that if this team continued to stick together and play around their bot lane, that they were going to be a pretty good team to look forward to. And as well, any team that's going to have the Shy and Rookie are going to be incredibly popular. And on top of that, they had Mako, who so many people love, and I think is one of the Chinese players that gets the most recognition around the world. I think, barring Keria, a lot of people would have Mako as their support GOAT, and I don't think you can really say that for any other Chinese players. Some people might have Uzi or Jackie Love as their ADC GOATs, but I think that's a lot less common than people that would now have Mako as their second best support of all time. So I think putting all these players together on the same roster was something that was really good for the LPL. We saw that they were single-handedly carrying viewership in a lot of their games, and I was excited to see what they'd be able to put out in 2026, leaning into this identity and continuing to improve, because I think that they got so much better towards summer. And it's really frustrating to me to hear that now the Shy is probably not going to be playing at all in 2026. Briefly we were hearing that Elk is going to be coming to IG, and that would cause Mako to decide actually not to take a break and to stick around. But now we hear that Elk is going to Weibo, and that's pretty much confirmed. Mako might now go back to deciding to take a break. Poor guy. Wei is still going to be there. Rookie's still going to be there. You were hearing that maybe Breathe would be the new top laner because Elk wanted to play with Breathe so badly. But now that Elk's probably going to be going to Weibo, who knows what the heck is going on with their top lane situation. So, yeah, IG just went from a team that I was excited to watch again for so many reasons. They're entertaining, they're great personalities, to something that's just not so rock solid and just a lot more flaccid to think about. So, yeah, that's a little disappointing. But I do hope that maybe if it's 1xN that ends up joining them, for example, that he's able to get a chance to shine, because I do think that he's a player that was stuck on a really bad team this year, and maybe with some better teammates, he'll start to get some more love from the league and around the world. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. The longer style, I think this is going to be roughly 40 minutes, is a bit of an experiment. I don't know if people really want to listen to me talk for 40 minutes, but hey, if you watched all the way through and you enjoyed this, please leave a like, a comment, and a subscription. Hugely appreciated, and I hope you're looking forward to the remaining videos that are going to come out. The next one's going to be about BLG, and hopefully I can put that one out a lot quicker than I was able to with this one. Thank you so much.